So welcome everybody to the August 22nd meeting of the British Empire Study Group. We'd like to thank everyone for taking time out of their day or evening or morning to join us, and this should be a really interesting talk. Without any more discussion, I'm going to turn it over to my co-host, Mr. Robert Luton, to introduce tonight's speaker. Robert?
Thank you, Joan. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the August British Empire Study Group presentation, 19th Century Indo-American History through Philately. Approximately 2.7 million Americans make up the second largest immigrant group in the United States who regard India, or Bharat in Sanskrit, as their motherland. Americans of Indian descent have played a significant and often overlooked role in American history. Our program this evening focuses on the role of both the Americans and Indians in Indo-American history through the use of philatelic artifacts and postal history, showing the contributions that both have made to our relations involving the mercantile trades, maritime trade and navigation, U.S. consular services, American missionaries, Sanskrit, and theology. Seasoned philatelist Ravi Vora will demonstrate how philately, modernly thought of as an old person's hobby, can be used to add fabric to historical stories, allowing a person to reach back and hold a piece of history, connecting the relationship between the two countries. So now a little background on our presenter this evening, Ravi Vora. The bug of stamp collecting began at the age of 8 years when he received a packet of colorful stamps from an uncle while he was hospitalized in Bombay. The interest transformed to philately, to postal history, and on to creating stories from the lens of philately over the last 5 decades. Examples of recent stories include 19th century Indo-American history through philately, World War I to Versailles Peace Treaty through diplomatic and military mail, India combination frankings, U.S. consular services and its stamps, and the history of the U.S. Department of State and its consular diplomatic services. Ravi's also written articles for the American Philatelist, the U.S. Philatelic Classic Society, and the India Post. He's a retired international business professional with the clean energy business. He lives with his wife, Kathy, in Arvada, Colorado, and enjoys spending time with his 4 grandchildren in the Pacific Northwest. So without further ado, let me give you our esteemed presenter for this evening, Ravi Vora.
Thank you very much, Joanne, and Rob, for inviting me for this journey that is going to cover a lot of stories, a lot of obscure and maybe some lesser known information, and see if we can weave that into a collage of how enriched the history is between our two countries. I personally was born in India, but I became a US citizen about 60 years ago, so I'm pretty much American. We're showing, this is our first slide to show kind of what highlights of what we're going to cover. We're going to basically, so you can see there are 2 images. One is a building on the left. Other one is a portrait of 3 women, which includes the first Indian woman to get a medical degree in the United States. And the image of the building is the first American ice house. So one of the interesting things we'll learn is some of the contributions of Americans to India's diverse history and society. I think Rob has pretty well highlighted what we're going to cover. So we're going to go to the next slide. Rob? We just want to give you a little more details about what we hope to cover. And basically, we are doing 5 things. One is really the relevant postal history on mail between the two countries. Most important thing is really what triggered those. And that really consists of maritime and mercantile trade and relationships and the routes that were taken to sail between the two nations. surprisingly, maybe, but not so much, is the importance of the U.S. consular relations in supporting the mercantile and maritime trade. Last two things are important, somewhat different than most people would think about, and that's the religion. American missionaries played a historical role in emergence of India as a modern nation. And last but not the least, we will talk about the growing role of Americans on India's Sanskrit and the theology and the religions of India. So, with much ado, we'll go to the second one. This one we are showing, or I'm showing, one of the earliest mail from Bombay to United States in 1807 from an American called Frederick Humphreys. Not much known about him, but he writes to a very prominent trading firm, Samuel Arnold's in Providence, Rhode Island. This most interesting about this particular letter is that it did travel Cape Horn or Cape of Good Hope, I'm not sure. But what's significant is that it reached United States in Savannah, Georgia. For those of you who collect transatlantic mail, majority of the mail coming to the U.S. East Coast arrived on New York, Boston, some of the further northeast ports. So arrival of the early letter from India into Savannah, Georgia is somewhat unusual. I think the sailing time of 7 months is not uncommon. We'll talk about in another slide the routes and what triggered those routes. So okay, well, let's go to the next one. Next slide, please. Rob. Oh yeah, okay. This letter contains a lot of information. It's a letter that was sent from Canton in 1810 to Calcutta. On my record, it's one of the earliest mail, and it took 60 days to travel. Actually, the letter that was sent from Canton was originally originated from United States in Massachusetts, and it was meant for some American traders that originally were in Calcutta but had gone on to they were originally in Canton, but they then moved on to Calcutta. And what's more important is the letter relates to a trade embargo between the United States and in England or Great Britain in that time period, where under Britain had imposed embargo against American ships sailing both in Atlantic as well as further Indian Ocean. And this it was an important deterrent for American trade. It took almost 9 months for the American traders in Calcutta to understand or learn that embargo had been lifted. On the top right, you see a proclamation from the President of the United States that announced the lifting of the trade embargoes. So it's an interesting, you know, information about how the traders faced and dealt with these political and disputes and how it affected their business and their travels. Next slide. One of the interesting things that comes out in early mercantile letters is the challenges and opportunities American traders faced in trading with India and China. Effective during this time, opium trading was the most important trade and most prosperous and profitable trade. However, East India Company and Great Britain had absolute monopoly on that trade. And this particular letter really is from a trader in Calcutta to his cousin in Philadelphia. And he does highlight the fact that the monopoly of East India Company to export opium to China, uh, which also was under dispute by the Chinese. And even at that time, Port of Canton was closed, but he was hoping that there would be opportunity for free trade for Americans to participate in a trade with China, particularly involving opium, which had limited success, by the way, as the history would tell. We go to the next one. Uh, this is another letter that actually of information about Franco-American crisis. The letter was sent from Calcutta to Boston through Philadelphia, where it shipped postmark, which I think many of those who collect American postal history are familiar with it. There are only 10 letters known with that postmark, so it's relatively uncommon. Uh, and what is interesting about this letter is that he basically it took, by the way, 114, it talks about the writes to his brother about his travel to Calcutta, which took him 114 days. And he had a bet with somebody before he left Boston. And so he said he won the bet because he got there, I guess, maybe less than 4 months. There are other more important information. He reports impact of the Franco-American dispute, and they had fears for Americans sailing back to U.S. from India about being captured by French Navy. What's interesting about that Franco-American crisis, you'd say, what does that have to do with India and America? But it did affect the sailing and the trading between the two countries. That dispute actually was resolved in 1831, where France was supposed to compensate the United States $25 million, a lot of money then. But it took literally 4 years for France to finally pay to the United States $25 million, and it had a happy ending. But the point of this how international dispute affected the travel and the trading and the shipping between the two countries. Next. This is another trade-related letter from Calcutta. It is addressed to Augustine Hurd. Again, those of you who follow or study American trading from 19th century earlier, Augustine Hurd was the most prolific and most successful trader, particularly in China. However, he was not as successful in India. And this colleague of his from Calcutta is mentioning that maybe he should consider getting involved in trading opium from non-India. Turkey was another major supplier of opium to China, and trade it for tea. And I think that Augustine Hurd certainly was very prolific trader on tea, but not so much on opium. The letter was sent via Cape of Good Hope, and it took over 5 months. We're not talking too much about the rates because I think that can be dealt with separately. Moving to the next slide. Rob, I think someone is saying that they have difficulty listening. Should we pause to see if it can be fixed? Rob or
Yeah,
John?
Ravi, everything is clear on my computer.
Okay,
Okay.
well, I saw a message,
Yeah,
someone said
I
there.
saw the note.
Joanne, should we continue?
Yeah, I think we should continue. I think everyone else could hear. So
Okay,
I
that's
think
fine.
like,
All right.
White, I'll try to message you privately and
Okay, that's fine. All right. So this one is a kind of an interesting oddball trading that I never thought I would hear about. 1836, It was privately carried on American ship Florida via Cape of Good Hope. And what is more interesting is about a new American trader who arrives in Calcutta. Uh, he was complaining about how long the passage was and how horrible the captain was. But most important information he relayed back was there was a great demand for American and Arabian horses in India. I suspect this is about the time where East India Company was expanding their military presence, and good quality horses were important for them. And I suspect that was very profitable because he thought that if you ship some horses from United States, you can triple your money. Not a bad trading. Okay, can we go to the next one? Next slide. Now, this is one of the more important insights about what was the important trading between India and United States. How many of you wear jeans regularly? I think most of us do. And the history of jeans in United States is very long and rich. And what I think would be interesting to know is that the major source of the dye to make jean fabric is indigo, which was naturally grown. And Merrimack was the largest manufacturer of calico cloth in United States. You see on the right the picture of their facility on the East Coast. It was huge. They literally had the monopoly. This letter is sent in 1841 from their buying agent George Dixwell in Calcutta. He goes to a great length about where and how he gets best quality of indigo and report that he most recently shipped 20,000 US dollars worth of indigo from India to United States. And there's some more information about that. The letter was sent through London. Baring Brothers forwarded. Baring Brothers were very well-known merchant bankers. I think they still exist in London. Well, that's another trivia. But I think I wanted to just kind of leave with the colleagues or participant that this is another example of a major trading between India and United States and the role of indigo that India provided to the jeans and calico cloth manufacturing in the United States. Next. This is a very interesting set of information here. This letter was sent in 1851 from Calcutta to Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 52 days. What the letter does talk about is the name was hard to read, so I don't have the name, but he reports a sensational news of a murder by an American teenager named Francis Wary at the Ice House on New Year's Eve. And I'm showing the picture of the Ice House in Calcutta, which was actually uh, built in 1851. But the most important information I would like to share here is one of the major contribution of American traders to India was introduction of ice to the tropical parts of India. And I don't know if many people know, but an American trader called Frederick Tudor first brought ice in large blocks in 1833 to India. The story is that traders like Frederick realized that there was a very successful practice of New England to store large blocks of ice that they carved out during winter time and put it down in the basement and covered with sawdust so the ice would survive most of the summer months for their use. When traders like Frederick visited Calcutta, he found out very quickly that the British soldiers who would normally drink gin and tonic as a drink, but also to fend off malaria, were bitterly complaining about not having anything to cool down their drink in absence of ice. So, shrewd trader that Frederick was, he said, well, why can't I just bring huge blocks of ice on the ship covered with sawdust? And surely it can survive not only the sailing time of 2, 3 months, but last for large number of period of time where he was very very successful and profitable business. Going back to the murder mystery, the writer says that there was expected execution by the British judge in Calcutta, but there was an intervention from England. There was a group called Victorians Against Gallows that pleaded against the execution of the American teenager. However, we have no records of whether they were successful or not, but I just thought it was fascinating that this one letter contains so much intriguing and exciting information that you would miss out if you didn't read the letter. It's one of my favorite anyway. Thanks. Next. Now we're going to talk about the sailing. One of the things that I had all speculated and did not have enough information is what were the sailing routes in the early 19th century. One of my very good friend, John Barvis, uh, who is an eminent philatelist, many of you may know him. He and I have been friends for 40 years. When I saw him last year in Taos, he and I talked about his research on the sailing routes based on the wind and ocean currents that determine how the ships sailed. So he shared with me this Royal Navy map of 1973, and it shows how it was not uncommon for the ships to travel not only around the Cape of Hope, Good Hope, as you can see, the blue dotted line, uh, either from the Far East or India, and but more importantly, the current direction actually would bring the closest port was Brazil. This one refers to Recife, and then from then on, it would coach on the currents to go to New York. And this I wanted to share to show how the next letter we're gonna discuss traveled. Next. So we have about two more slides about a fascinating letter that was sent in 1809 from Calcutta. It was sent through Cape of Good Hope. As you can see, there's a Cape of Good Hope cancellation. And more interestingly, this particular letter ended up going to Rio de Janeiro. And from Rio de Janeiro, it went to New York and Providence, Rhode Island. It was sent outside of Calcutta post office, so on a ship that I am not familiar with. But that's the result. There's no Calcutta postmark or rate marking. However, at Cape of Good Hope, it was transferred to another ship, and there was a 1 shilling charge for the transit fee. And then the letter actually left Cape of Good Hope around May 1809. It did not reach Rio de Janeiro till March 10, 1810, and then it must have been held up maybe due to limited ship sailings, but it ended up in Providence on May the 10th, 1810. It took over 1 year to travel from Calcutta to Providence, Rhode Island. We can go to look at the content of the letter in the next slide. This is a very fascinating letter by an American merchant who was stranded in Calcutta to Brown and Ives, again another very well-known trading house in Providence in 18th and 19th century. he actually was on a ship, American ship from China, I assume from Canton to Calcutta, but he fell out with the ship captain. And so he was basically kicked out by the ship captain in Calcutta. He was fortunate to be helped by an American trader. Apparently, there was some legal dispute, so he had to go to the court in Calcutta, but he was able to get, a, you know, court approval for him to go back home. And but his main concern at that time was also the British embargo against American ships that was prevailing, which we saw in an earlier letter from Canton to Calcutta. So it just goes to show how political disputes affected the travel risk and the time it took to travel. So another interesting insights on different things that affected both the travel and the business relationship. This is another fascinating, or we can go to the next one, that's fine. Next. This one, no, can you go back, please? So this, the next one, the one with the map. No, next. Yeah, please stay there. Uh, this is a fascinating letter that was written by Reverend Green, Samuel Green, who had sailed in 1847 from Boston on a ship to Madras via Ceylon. And what is most amazing to me, this is one of the few things that I've never seen where a traveler on a ship from Boston to India, every week he would handwrite or hand locate location of his ship, uh, on where the ship was, and it shows how it went around Cape of Good Hope and onwards to Indian Ocean to Ceylon. But it's one of the most fascinating detail of his travel. It took 104 days, a little over 3 months, and to me, it's a great representation of how actual ship routing took place. I think it must have stopped at St. Helena for restocking the supplies as well as coal. Uh, and I think this is one of the most favorite cartography letter I've seen that I have. Can we go to the next one? So this is the letter in that on the other side, and it was actually hand carried by some member of the family or another missionary back to Worcester, because one of the things that we'll talk about later is that missionaries, whether Americans or British, really were not prosperous. They had limited for missionaries to send their letters between India and US with the fellow missionaries that travel back and forth. So this letter was also hand carried. Uh, he had written it on 2nd of September. But what I find more fascinating is his detailed description of what, at least in those times, would be considered a very luxurious uh, sailing travel on the ship that gave them four sumptuous meals every day. He described in detail what was the breakfast, what was the lunch, what was the dinner, what included dessert. But he also had some complaints about rats and spiders and black flies. So it's another fascinating travelogue that we don't find that common or that easy, but it does give us some insights. I was just surprised to see how luxurious the travel was in 1847, considering all the limitations those ships had. Next. This is a little more insights on the ship captains, what happens to them or crews and their salary. This is a report by a ship captain that had taken the ship from Montego, Jamaica, from there to Mobile, Alabama. from there to Havre, France, and then on to Calcutta. And he reports back to the ship owner, Ichabod Goodwin. The ship was called Morning Glory, and he actually gives a very detailed account of the salaries and the payments he made. He points out what was the exchange rate at that time in 1856. $1 was equal to 1 rupee 79 paisa or 79, which would be closer to 1 rupee 12 annas. Compare that to today's exchange rate of $1 is equal to close to 83 rupees. That's what inflation does. But even more interesting to me was the highest paid crew was the first mate. He was paid $40 a month, princely sum. The lowest paid was the seaman. But guess who was the second highest salary? That was the carpenter. As you could imagine, carpenters were very important for sailing ships in those days because it was not uncommon for the wind related problems that they needed to deal with. Uh, so this is to me another insights we don't see often about what are the you know ships sailings, and then what were the cost and what the challenges the ship captain had. Next, now we talk about the role of consulates in India. First consulate was established in 1794. Actually, it was a consular agent, Benjamin Joy, who died in Calcutta in 1794. However, East India Company would not recognize him as a consular agent, uh, obvious reasons, from a newly independent America. So he was accommodated to be called commercial agent. I haven't seen any correspondence to or from him. The earlier one I do have is one from U.S. Vice Consul Freer in 1852 to his counterpart Aspinwall in U.S. In England, U.S. Consul in England. And the details are very minor. It's more administrative related to. The second example is on the right, which is an 1860 cover. Excuse me, U.S. Consul General in Calcutta, who sends a very heavy set of documents, I assume is a bill of lading, to an American merchant in Philadelphia. Uh, and this was an important role that American consuls played worldwide for export and import, particularly the exports from foreign countries to United States. They were the ones to certify and forward bill of lading both to the importers and more often to the custom house to be able to establish the customs duty and customs clearance. It happens to be very nice use of 6 8 ana stamps and so forth. Next. Now we go to another interesting trivia. The first U.S. consulate was established in 1838. Don't have the name of the consul, but more importantly, in 1852, American consul in Bombay was on a leave. They were given annual leave to go back home. And when he left in 1852, he appointed a very successful Indian Parsi businessman, Dasabai Marwanji. He's very well known and done a lot of correspondence where he is a forwarding agent. So this is the first example I have seen where a letter from the United States was sent to Dasabai Marwanji as the Vice Consul of the United States in Bombay, India. So it's again one of the I don't know if he was the first non-American consul appointed by U.S. State Department or not, but at least it's first Indian one to be in that position. The second one is a local letter to Thomas Biddle in 1858, a few years later. who replaced his predecessor who died of dysentery. And interestingly, he was staying at the Bombay governor's house, which I'm showing on the right. So the letter is addressed to him, care of the government house, where apparently he wasn't there. Next. The other important services U.S. consuls provided was dealing with shipping. So we have two examples of communications from American ship agent in London writing to U.S. consul in Bombay. The first one on the left, I'm not going into detail about the stamps and the rates. I think you can look at it and study at leisure. But apparently, the letter is important because he, on the behalf of the owner of the American ship, he appoints a gentleman called W.C. Graham as a new captain because the captain of the ship that arrived in Bombay had died. So, U.S. Council who had the authority to appoint successors on American ships. That's that example. The second one is another letter from the same uh, same agent to U.S. consul in Bombay. This time he has arranged a payment of £500 to be transferred through U.S. consul in Bombay to the new ship captain. And because he wasn't sure whether the ship was still in the port of Bombay, and he said if the ship has already sailed for Kaloa, Peru, to forward this money and the letter to the U.S. consul in Kalawa, Peru. It just shows you how important U.S. consuls played the role in facilitating American shipping and mercantile trade in India and world over. Next. Now we're going to move our subject matter to the role of American missionaries. While I'm not showing it here, actually, the first American missionary that arrived in India was in 1812. He was a guy called, I don't have the name in front of me, but when he arrived in Calcutta, he was unwelcome by East India Company. At that time, East India Company was promoting uh, Christianity of Indian local population, but they were depending primarily on English missionaries, and they thought that American missionary would compete. So he was expelled from Calcutta, and he ended up going to Burma. That's another story. But now we're going to come to uh, several years later about another successful American missionary called Sandal Monge. And he lived in Bombay, mostly in Western India, from 1834 to 1865, where he died. The American missionary by then actually had an active support from East India Company. I think one of the perspective to keep in mind about the success or the role or expanding role of American and British missionary, but we're going to talk about American missionary, is that it was in congruence with the East India Company's desire to create a large population of Indians. Preferably, they could become Christian. They would adapt to English ways and effectively support the East India Company's rule in India. It was a very interesting, shall we say, complementary role where American missionaries were gung ho on spreading Christianity world over to heathens, and East India Company's desire to get more Indians converted to Christianity. The letter is sent to a fellow missionary in Ohio, and it's a very detailed letter about how significant Brahmins are obstacles to Christianity and how they've spread lots of falsehoods. And more importantly, he does have a conscience because he's questioning the fairness of the British conquest of India. Uh, So it's a very fascinating insights about the observations and the thinking of American missionaries in this period. We got a few more missionaries examples, so we can go to the next one. So this was Giles Scudder was one of the first American missionary, but he was a medical missionary. So one of the interesting thing is how the role of the missionaries changed in Asia, and we are only talking about India, where they went beyond promoting gospel of Christ to really take well care of the people, local people or community, both through education. So you see propagation of Christian schools, but they also established medical clinics and promoting Western medicine. This particular letter was sent in 1850s, and amazingly, he portrays, he describes all the various Hindu practices. One of that is sacrificing, and this one he has a hand painted picture of a native with a steel rod that is pierced through his abdomen. And he was mentioning that this is an example of the belief to among Indians that to please the goddesses, self-inflicted pain and sacrifices are important. And it obviously demonizes the Hindu prayers and goddesses and abduction of children, uh, and how the Christian preaching is going to save the heathens. This particular uh, letter actually belong on a very well-known American collector, Riswold. By another side observation is I actually have a collection of watercolor paintings of in South India by another American missionary we mentioned, that's Reverend Samuel Green. But this is not the place or some topic to talk about it. But there's a very enriched history of American missionaries' role in depicting the society and the people and the lives of people in India in 1850s. Next. By 1840s, the importance of Sanskrit became recognized in American educational societies. And while before I talk more about Professor Salisbury, there is another example which we didn't have time or space to talk about, is where an American a young man had gone to Calcutta, got immersed in India things, and eventually became a scholar on Sanskrit and became a professor of Sanskrit in 1850s in Banaras. Amazing to see an American who is teaching Sanskrit in Banaras, which is the holiest place and where Sanskrit was important. But now, in this example, is a letter from Professor Salisbury. He was appointed the first professor of Sanskrit and Arabic in Yale University, came from a wealthy family, and he had actually written this letter from Germany, where he was in Europe, and he specifically went there to Paris to purchase a very famous library of Sanskrit and Arabic from French dealers. And he also met French Sanskrit scholar Bernouf. So amazing, even though this letter has nothing to do with India, it has everything to do with Professor Salisbury's role and his expertise on Sanskrit from 1840s. Next. We are coming to an end. Now we are reversing to show by 1870s, 1880s, the American society became more and more familiar with India and Indian culture and practices and religion and so forth. And there was an American missionary in Western India who had in his school a Brahmin teacher, and he became very close. and his wife, his name was Gopal Joshi, and this American missionary decided to send Gopal Joshi's wife to the United States. Her name was Anandbai, to study medical medicine at Women's College in Philadelphia. And I'm showing a picture of three foreign women who got medical degrees in 1886. You can see Anandbai Joshi on the right wearing Indian sari. There is a middle one, I think she's from Japan, if I'm not mistaken. And the third one is from Middle East. But it's amazing to see how American colleges accepted and provided medical education to Asians, in 1880s. While she was there, her husband, of course, came because that would have been traditional, would be unthinkable for a single Indian woman to travel and stay and study. But he was a scholar, and he became a very well-known lecturer, Gopal Nayak. So I found this envelope with a flyer promoting his lecture uh, in 1886, so by the same time. And it's fascinating because it describes the scope of the lecture, and also it was held at Shakespeare Club in Newton, Pennsylvania. So this is how we're going to end our story about Indo-American history, to cover a wide swath of topics, scope, period. To summarize, we can go to the next slide. So I hope that you will share my our philately actually opens up the window of the history of relationship between India and the United States, which is rich and diverse. We covered a very wide variety of roles and things we learned. And I guess with that, I'd like to end the presentation and have Rob entertain if there are any questions or answers, questions or suggestions or observations for the participants.
Well, thank you, Ravi. That was a really interesting presentation. I certainly learned a lot of stuff I had never seen before. I'm a little bit familiar with at the turn of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, there was a lot of interest in Sanskrit and in Indo history. I know
Yeah.
even in the occult and stuff like Madame Blavatsky and that, and Ravi, no, not Ravi, Vishnaswamy and
Yeah.
those people. I know there was a lot of activity right at the turn there. Do you ever see any postal history regarding that?
Not particularly the person you mentioned, but this subject matter and this topic is pretty wide open.
Hmm.
I know that one of the participants I've seen, who is a very close friend of mine, is Raj Rajan. I want to acknowledge him is a prominent expert on this subject matter. In fact, I learned a lot from him, and so he also has some wonderful examples that can further enrich this story.
All right. I was wondering while you were speaking, did India have any shipping of their own outside of the India company and the foreign companies?
Very good. Yeah. Actually, the shipping industry in India was very successful and very prosperous. I think that if my memory serves right, uh, even as early as 1830s, uh, group of Parsi businessmen in the Bombay or West Coast were very entrepreneurial, and they recognized that there was a tremendous need for ships by East India Company, but even the local merchants. And so what happened is that they figured out they can copycat, or they had their own ingenuity to design and build ocean sailing ships, to the point where they successfully competed against shipyards in England.
Ah,
It built the ships for English owners and East India Company and Indian shipping companies, because number of ships that were used for opium trade, particularly between India and China, they use Indian-built wooden ships. I think I actually even have somewhere engraving of the detailed wooden design of the wooden ship built by some Parsis. So you're right, the shipping industry was quite successful in India in the 19th century.
yeah. Had they done any explorations on their own such that they created their own maps and stuff? Any of the maps that you were showing us are sourced in India?
Well, no, I mean, I only showed one map, and that map was done by the missionary
Right.
that was traveling, right?
Yeah, on
But
that trip.
I do have some articles about maps created by Indians in India, but they were not related to uh, ocean going, or other continents. They were more related to maps of the Indian geography. And I do have an article on that somewhere, because I also, one of my side interests is collect antique maps and books of India.
Okay. Yeah, Raj Rajan made a comment here. It was really interesting. He said that some of Britain's finest sailing men of war were built in India from 1777 to 1849 by the Wadia family. They were
Yep.
master builders at the Bombay
Yes.
dockyards.
Yep. No, the other thing I think Raj mentioned, I just saw chat, is that the you talk about Indian role of the Indian explorers in their when the British decided to explore Tibet, uh, they immediately faced a lot of, shall we say, opposition from Tibetans for Western people to come there. So they actually hired uh, Indians from northern India that were conversant with the Tibetan language, the Nepalese language, and they used them as their, shall we say, scouts to go and explore Tibet on their behalf. And also, they were the worst, they were cartographers to do detailed mapping of Tibet region. So
Hmm.
Indians were used for that purpose because the Europeans were unwelcome there. And in fact, I have some correspondence from those Indians that were hired that by British military. That was in 1840s, 1830s, 1840s. Another interesting angle is that which is not exactly related to America, but Italian missionaries also played an important role in India.
Mm.
And one of the early missionary from Vatican was in Agra, and he actually promoted and supported promoting Christianity in Tibet.
So do we have any postal history reflecting any of this?
I do have, as I said, some correspondence from these Indians that were hired by the British military officer to do cartography of Tibet. I do have that in my collection. I
Hmm.
also have a legal document signed by the Vatican missionary in Agra related to promoting and funding the expedition by missionaries to Tibet.
All right. All right. Do we have any questions out there in the audience tonight? I don't see any hands raised yet.
No, there's one Q&A. I think on the Q&A there's one message. I don't know.
There you go, Rob.
All right. Dr. Bruce Wasserman.
Hi, that was an amazing presentation. And I really appreciate that. I have a couple of questions. One is, how do you, what is a good reference material for interpreting ships, covers, marks, When I
Sorry,
look
can
at
you,
stampless covers, it's tough to sort that out.
uh,
And I'm not sure if maybe my.
it's a question about rates and
Yeah,
routes?
no, I'm wondering about how you interpret if you have reference material for interpreting stampless ships covers.
So yeah, I mean, I think particularly rates and routes related from mid-19th century, they are pretty well covered by well-known, I don't have the names in front of me, but well-known books on rates and routes, both between US and Europe, and but then also it goes all the way to British India. Uh, there, in addition to the American books that I think, and like on sideline, I can give you the names. Of course, in Indian Philately, there's a very well-known book on the rates, particularly between India and different parts of the world from 1850s to 1870s. So those are also good reference material. But there's another with artificial intelligence, one of the things I'm beginning to learn, I'm still at the early stage, is if you log into Chat GPT, it's amazing how much quick information you will get on your questions on rates and routes.
Well, that's interesting.
Because I've just
Hey, can I add to that a little bit?
sure.
Hey, so I think the book, the classic reference for stampless covers for India would be Hammond Giles,
Yep.
Handstruck Postage Stamps of India, that contains both the stampless markings, and it has a generic guideline for interpreting the rates per se, especially the I would say pre-1830 rates, because often it used to be very complex because they had packet letter system, ship letter systems, all different kind of complex rate systems. In some cases, you had to tip the ship captain for the letter to be carried from India to the United Kingdom, and from there, transatlantic rates would apply. So it was pretty complex, but I think as a generic starting point, Hammond Giles serves as a good reference.
That's great. Thank you. And
Would
then,
you mind putting that in the chat? Because I guess I'm phonetically challenged. Is that something you could?
Giles, Giles, Hammond Giles.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Arvitam. It's a very good. That handbook is kind of the classic Bible for pre-stamp philately of India, British India, and does have companion edition that refers to the rates and the markings from 1830s to 1850s. But there are a number of other resources that are becoming available. And India Study Circle, if we can pitch a little bit of promotion, India Study Circle, that I think some of the participants are very, very, shall I say, active members. I've been a member for a few decades. But one of the most important thing about India Study Circle is that it has an amazing website with huge amount of literature and reference information. All of the publications for last 50, 60 years are online indexed. So you can research what's been published. So just if you have an interest, consider joining India Study Circle.
okay, cool. All right. Thank you very much.
John Spencer, you have your hand up.
Yes. Good evening, Ravi. Thank you very
Good
much
evening.
for a fascinating presentation. My question is, were there many routes across the Pacific to the west coast of America from India?
Good question. No, that's an excellent question. So it's a one that deserves a lot more research. It's also a function of the time period about the Pacific route from India to Americas, right? I think if I understand your question correctly. So there are two things that come to mind. Number one is really what was the opportunity and need for shipping goods between India and west coast of United States, if you follow me, because majority of the trade was between Indian ports and east coast of United States. Now, that didn't mean that the ships did not go via Pacific route. As one of the example I showed in my presentation was a reference to an Indian ship going from Bombay to Callao, Peru. I do have some examples in my collection from 1850s, 1860s, where they were sent from India or from India to San Francisco to and from. But in my experience, they're relatively uncommon, unlike the route through the Cape of Good Hope or through Suez. But I think it has more to do with the fact that there was just not as much trading done between west coast of United States and India, unlike between west coast and China, Philippines, Japan. So you see a ton of material. I don't mean to be negative, but there's a plethora of mail between west coast of United States and the Far East, but not as much uh, via Pacific to India.
Thank you.
All right, thanks for that. Here's a question from Lei Hogg. He says that Goa was a Portuguese colony on the Indian West
Yes.
Coast.
Right.
Do you know of any trade correspondence from that angle or any philatelic mail between India and North America?
You mean the mail between Portuguese Goa and,
Yes.
and North America?
Yes.
Offhand, I don't have that, but I do know of early 1800 mail from Goa, and it was not surprisingly sent to Lisbon, Portugal. However, it went through Brazil. So that's fairly, and it has a Brazilian postmark. It's one of the most uncommon example I have seen. I think that it was around 1810, 1811 time frame, if my memory serves right. Mail from Goa, Portuguese India to Lisbon via Brazil, but that did not go through the United States to my knowledge.
Okay.
There are two Q&A on the bottom of the screen, or have we covered them?
Let's see. Mark Miller is asking, as time went on, mail between India and the USA for commercial purposes only kept expanding. Does your collecting interest extend to more mundane or seemingly mundane commercial mail exchanges between the countries?
Between which countries? I'm sorry? I didn't quite follow the question.
Okay. Let's see.
Ravi, basically I'm asking is, as commercial exchanges between India and the US just expanded over time, to
Yes.
become commonplace, does
Yep.
your collecting interest extend to essentially what would look like mundane covers from book publishing companies or wheat farms or oil companies or aviation?
Sure.
Or
Right.
are you more like 19th century, really these early stages focused?
No, I think that you're making interesting points. So actually, there's a fair amount of examples of correspondence between publishing, particularly from India, to publishing companies in the United States, asking for literature, asking for books, asking for catalogs, even going back to late 19th century, post 1860, 1870. Reverse, you do see some less common correspondence from United States to Indian publishers, particularly in the 19th century. The other thing that I find from time to time, but not often, is correspondence from an Indian coin dealer in 1890s offering Indian coins to somebody in the United States. Those are far and few between, but correspondence between publishers in India and publishers in the United States or vice versa, particularly in early 20th century, I have some of them and I've seen quite a few of them. So you're right. As far as the wheat growing part, that was your second question. I have not really seen much correspondence related to farming. I think if I interpret your question, farming was still very localized, was not international in India in the 19th century. The only difference is that immigration patterns. If you study the immigration, particularly from Punjab, then there was a fairly steady increase of Punjabis immigrating, particularly to Canada and California. A number of them were farmers. And so they established farming, successful farming in California and west coast of Canada. And I do have one or two examples of correspondence between immigrants.
Hey, can I add something to that as well, if you don't mind, Ravi?
Sure. Oh, please do. You are
Yeah.
very.
No. I don't mean to steal your show, but
You're not stealing.
so
You
I
are a
think
fountain of knowledge.
no. What I mean to say is that I think a couple of things that just to expand a little bit. So by the turn of the century, what happened was, if you know Swami Vivekananda, so
Yes.
he came to the United States and he spread the philosophy of Vedanta. And
Yep.
right after that, Indian missionaries, they came over here in the
Yes.
United States
Yes.
to set up, in fact, the first like Vedanta monks. I mean, they are still in existence. They are called
Yep.
Ramakrishna missions.
Yep.
So those missionary males are I wouldn't say they are common, but they are found. I do have a few in my collection. And to
Yep.
add to Ravi's point, I think immigration from the Punjab to the West Coast is a very significant episode of shared history between India and the United States,
Yes.
particularly because especially in San Francisco, it was
Yep.
also the founding place of the Gadar movement, which was the Indian nationalist movement that would eventually become one of the dominant forces during World War II. The inception did happen in San Francisco. So the males are pretty scarce. In fact, they're not found because it was banned, especially during the First World War. But there are one or two males that kind of slipped censorship and they survive as well. So I think to answer your question, mundane males they do have a contextual history. In fact, more than what we can fathom at times. Yeah.
I think we may be running out of time, but one last point I would add to what you're saying, Tom, is another interesting angle is the military history between the United States and India or Indian subcontinent, particularly in the World War I and World War II period. But that's another subject matter, not 19th century.
That's very interesting. Oh, Richard.
Hi, Ravi. How are you? I've seen three instances of correspondence between Kingwood, West Virginia, and Moradabad, India. It's addressed to Dr. Julia Lohr, and I'm willing to share it. It's a very nice cover.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay, I can.
Very nice. So,
But is there a good bit of correspondence? Because I've seen
Right.
correspondence from over a period of several years.
Yeah, so I think there was a fairly large correspondence from 1860s to 1880s between there was a large number of American missionaries in India. And, Bissell, for example, was a well-known missionary. And you will find really good number of mail, more from United States to the American missionaries in India, with various type of frankings, like the one you showed, very attractive, right? But what is less common, if you're interested in postal history, is that missionaries really were trying to save money. So it wasn't uncommon for the missionaries to send mail either from India to United States or from United States to India by having it carried by fellow missionaries on ships. And then they drop it off at the American Board of Missionaries in Boston. And then American Board of Missionaries would pay local postage for domestic mail in the United States. So one of the things I find fascinating is that they were very clever in figuring out how to save money when it was pretty expensive to send mail between India and the United States. But I think that the mail you showed probably were from prosperous family or colleagues or friends who money was not that a problem. So you're right. And of course, as you may know, there's a one of the most famous cover is the ice house covers. I don't know if any of you follow that history or not, but 1869, the only known 90-cent 1869 stamp used on cover was sent to Ice House in Calcutta, India. And it was reconstructed, and I think Scott Trappels put it in an auction several years ago. But to me, that's a classic philately of a prized, 90-cent, bicolor stamp sent to India. That's the only one known used on cover.
All right. Okay,
But thank
Lay,
you
I
for
see
the-
you have your hand up. Lay Hogg?
No, thank you.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I'll put your hand down. There's one question from Jean in the Q&A about what the major source of the letters were. Did you cover that?
Yeah, I
No,
can.
no, we didn't cover that.
No. So major source of covers. Well, I don't know how to answer that question other than that they do come in the philatelic market through various means, right? And majority of the what I shared were acquired in philatelic market through various channels. It's less common to find correspondence come from estates. And I'll give you an example because actually I forgot. So because I think it's a very interesting question. In my presentation, I showed a cartography map which showed where the Reverend Samuel Green plotted the journey of his ship every week through from Boston to Madras. If you go back to the presentation, you'll see that. That particular letter, I was acquired from an estate sale of the Green family several years, decades ago. So once in a while, you do have these estates from old generation of families where they offer it through various auction houses, but not necessarily stamp auction houses. So that's another, uh, you know, less common source. I don't know if I answered the question right.
I think India is one of the more popular countries to find at least stampless letters too.
Yep. No, you're right. They're not. You're quite correct.
But boy, did they go in some weird directions.
Someone mentioned that about one of the things we did talk about. I think one of the participants said they acquired a large number of covers when they lived in India 40 years ago. But language is a problem. So there are, just to answer that participant's comment, yeah, there are examples of mail written by Indians in their native language going abroad, and invariably postal clerks in India would translate the address or the name of the recipient in English so that it can successfully be sent through the postal system and delivered to the recipient. So that's another trivia, I guess. And that's typically mail, particularly between immigrants and soldiers' families. I don't know if that. Cool.
Tony Plum. You have a question?
One thing that went through my head was that in Malaya and Southeast Asia, there's a very considerable amount of correspondence associated with the chettiars, a kind of banking system financing trade.
Yes.
And I wondered if the same had operated at all into the States.
Yeah, chettiars are, I mean, it's a very well-known legacy, right, between the families in South India and Southeast Asia. And there was a migration, very active trade and financial business. I think the other area of correspondence between local merchant in the Opium War, there was fair number of Parsis, even Persians and other Indian Gujaratis that were active traders and who did business between India, Singapore, and China during opium trade. And I have some correspondence written in local native language, Gujarati or Parsi Gujarati, between the traders between India and China or Singapore. And those are entirely in local languages, except for the address to facilitate, mailing of the envelopes, the letters. These are all pre-stamped letters. So that's another angle. But there wasn't as much in 19th century. There were not as many the Indian traders in the United States, so that you don't see, at least not to my knowledge.
All right. Raphael, you have your hand up.
Do I?
Yes.
Oh, no, I don't have a question. I guess I was touching the lap.
Oh, sleep at the wheel.
Yeah,
Right.
sorry.
Doug.
It's an observation, really, that we've heard some really interesting stuff about the time it took to carry mail from India to the US and reverse. Just an observation that the first submarine telegraph cable was laid between Porthcurno in Cornwall in the south of the UK across to India, 5,000 miles. It was first used in 1870. And of course, the market traders were soon making good use of that, not for the common missionary correspondence, but for the important stuff. That sort of written mail would become less and less as the telegraph grew.
That's very true. Not as common to see mail involving telegraph lines, particularly in the 1870s, after they were laid.
Yep.
So, yep, you're right. Some hand raised.
Raj?
Yeah, I know there was a question about chettiars. They their mail primarily was from India, not just southern India, but also from Calcutta, because they followed the British up to Calcutta and through there to Burma, and most of all their mail written almost entirely to their family members in the expat communities in Southeast Asia is all between India or between these countries, which is Burma, primarily Burma, Malay Peninsula, Singapore, Dutch East Indies, Medan Delhi region, and in the Dutch East Indies, Vietnam, mostly Saigon, some from Cambodia, from Phnom Penh, and a few letters from Phuket and Thailand. And that's pretty much the extent of all their mail that exists as postal history. There was nothing, no communications. They didn't have any trade connections or any of their family members in the Americas. So if you get to the Americas, most of the mail outside the U.S. would be with the indentured labor community in British Guiana, Demerara, Trinidad, and Suriname, and some to the Caribbean and Jamaica and a couple of other places, St. Vincent and a couple of other places in the Caribbean. But outside of that, as Ravi mentioned, the Gujarati communications in the Indian Ocean sphere from Mauritius, Reunion, Seychelles, Zanzibar, and of course Elchi Nauroji, who's based in New Jersey. He collects, particularly focus on Parsi merchants and a lot of forwarding agents, Parsi forwarding agents, all the way from Aden, starting from Burma, the Ark, all the way down to Zanzibar through Aden, and that's a lot of interesting Parsi postal history. But it's interesting blocks, indentured labor, merchants, and as Ravi said, World War I and World War II, a lot of American soldiers deployed in India, and the missionaries and merchants that Ravi talked about is really the icing on the cake. A lot of interesting early mail. The earliest letter I have from a American missionary in India is from 1817, written while at sea, and those are fascinating letters. And there are a lot of American forwarding agent markings, most of them from Calcutta. I have 6 or 7 different American forwarding agents, mostly in the 1850s.
Yep.
And of course, the other piece is William Wetmore and Augustine Hurd and Russell and Company, all the British and American merchants who were present in Canton, and the opium smuggling. There was a lot of mail exchange there, some of which did make it from Calcutta to the US.
But I think that to me the fascinating piece was the correspondence involving American traders in China and India both. To me, that's the fascinating part, because that communications are not as common, at least not I haven't come across, but that also reflected the political dispute between the United States and England. The monopoly that East India Company and Britain, had an ironclad monopoly, and that basically locked out American traders from doing very profitable business related to opium. And that may be one reason why you don't see as much opium related mail between India and Americans, because they were just locked out.
Yeah, interesting. You say that, Ravi. William Wetmore, when he traveled to South America and then on to Canton and he did spend some time in Calcutta. There was a lot of course, a lot of the American opium trade was out of Smyrna and Turkey.
Yep, Turkey.
And they did later stages in the game did get some of the Turkish opium to India and repackaged it with Malwa and Banaras opium, because they fetched higher prices, and it's sort of the watering down of the opium, similar to what the Medellin cartel and the Mexican drug smugglers are doing. They were a lot of the wealthy American houses were involved in
Yep.
doing that, and they're trying to get the opium instead of shipping it just to Malta, which is what they did with the Smyrna opium, Turkish opium. They got
Yep.
it down to East India Company ships and then got it to Calcutta and then shipped it to China.
Yep. No, you're right. That's more obscure.
In trouble, right? Drug smuggling, right?
Yep, absolutely.
And some of the most wealthiest families in the Northeast made their money through opium smuggling to China.
Absolutely. Yeah, no question about it. Yeah. But I'm grateful for the active participation by
AB?
colleagues and friends.
Yeah, just to add a couple of points there, I think one of the most, I would say, underappreciated history. I mean, every classic India collection begins with a set of correspondences of Strenchem Master. And they are in the early, I would say, mid 1670s, all the way to 1680s or 90s. So the interesting thing is those letters, they come from the estate of Elihu Yale, who was also an East India Company director, which was the founder of the Yale University. So that's one big, and he made a lot of money through slaves from Madras, Indian slaves or native Indian slaves from Madras. So I think that's one of, I would say, not so very happy shared history between India and the United States, but that typically Strenchem Master begins to be the first item in any serious classical Indian collection. And to other point as to the source of some of these letters, I think not too long ago, there was a letter that was sold in eBay. It was not for a very small amount. I had to pay a very high price for it, but it contains the only known description of sati, which is basically a woman, like in India, in the Hindu tradition, women were burned alive with their husbands, with their dead husbands. And there was an American missionary who was observing that, saying that such a barbaric thing was happening right in front of his eyes. And that letter contains a whole lot of, like, it's very descriptive, like what was happening and all of that. And sati is, in fact, it of course became a poster child for the Indian culture to be revived from so-called barbarism and all of that, but it was still a rare event. And an American merchant observing that at that time in the 1829 is pretty fascinating, and once in a while they pop up in eBay, no less, right? So I just wanted to make that point. Thanks.
Fascinating.
Oh, good find. There's a lot of forgeries in India also, aren't there? Not so much postal history, right?
Yeah, postal history is, I think in Indian stamps, yeah, there are a lot of Indian stamps that are forged, but I think postal history with all the paraphernalia, like the rates, the routes, the usages and everything else, they constitute a lot of different things. Like you have to get a lot of different things right to make a convincing forgery. So sometimes it becomes difficult to forge a postal history per se, but they do exist.
It still happens. We have censorship markings from World War I and World War II from different places in India that are forged. So it does make it way into postal history too. Yeah.
Well, what's the main expertising body for India?
Good question.
BPA and RPSL, but there are debates around that too. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, those are the standard go-to. I wasn't sure if there was like a really.
Yeah.
That's it.
I know I understand it's tricky to send it to India for expertising, but.
No. can't.
Well, there's no well-established Indian expertising organization in India anyway.
Mhm.
It is not well recognized or respected. So
Yeah.
It's a subject that Ravi has brought up repeatedly, particularly the India Study Circle for Philately, that we should be able to set up, at least through the ISC, which is now quite active here in the US, expertise services for Indian material. But at this point, outside of RPSL and BPL, there's not much choice.
true.
I was trying to find it's a cover that was featured in the catalog of Monopophil, and that is one of the most celebrated covers of Indian postal history. And when it was sold back in I think 2000 in solely contractor sale, it was kind of debatable, and it got a white BPA certificate. I'm trying to find the cover, and I literally discovered, I would say, yeah, this is the cover. So I'm not sure if you guys can see it, but let me see if I can not. Yeah, okay. Can you see the cover?
Yes, just about.
So this covers are, I mean, it's one of the most expensive covers in Indian philately, but the stamps do not belong to the cover. And without that, the value kind of goes down. And the only way to make that conclusion is through reading the postal notices. And this has been out there for a long, long time. So one has to make logical sense. So like I said, you have to get a lot of things right to forge postal history properly, and that knowledge is getting developed, I would say, as we there.
All right.
Well, it
All
sounds
right.
like the Indian Studies Circle has a lot of information about
Yes.
this postal history, which would be a great
All right.
great place to start if you get something that you're not sure of.
Yep.
Well, that's it. Are we all talked out?
So
Yeah. Ravi, that was fantastic. I mean, that
thank
was
you.
very, very interesting.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you,
well
Ravi.
done, Ravi.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye-bye.
I just point out that the embargo against US ships was not really picking on the Americans, despite the fact that they threw tea into the Boston Harbor to make tea with bales of tea in cold water. Very uncivilized. The Navigation Act was against all foreign shipping, including the Dutch, the Spanish, and the French. To a lesser extent, the Portuguese, because England and Portugal were allies for many, many years, because they have the same opinion of the Spanish.
Thank you, Duncan. That's very good.
So, Duncan, are you saying they were trying to get a monopoly on drugs?
No, not just it was the monopoly on trade.
Oh,
Trade,
and
yes.
everything, not
Yep,
just
trade.
The trade paid the taxes supported the Royal Navy, the Royal Navy kept trade safe. And
Very true.
Interestingly enough, on the Barbary Coast in the Mediterranean, it was one of the first times that the British and the Americans cooperated, because the pirates were a danger to both of them.
Yeah, right.
Well,
And so cooperation worked.
you're right about Duncan. I think if you're interested, you should contact me on Sideline. I have some mail from 1790s from American consuls in that area about how they were trying to fight off the piracy and capturing Americans or Europeans ships by the North the North African the ruler, I mean, sheikhs, I guess. Basically, Morocco, I think, if I remember right.
Yeah, I think that was the area that became.
But I'm not saying it right.
The Barbary Coast.
Barbary Coast, yeah, Aero Sea.
Not related to my family.
No, I presumably not. Thank you so much. I'm just gonna say goodbye and thank you for opportunity to share.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful, Ravi.
Thank you.